Christmas morning, and we have gathered here today for our Monday morning Introduction to Philosophy and Theory class. If you are joining us for the very first time today, welcome. Every single Monday, I teach an Introduction to Philosophy and Theory and Psychoanalysis class. If you're a complete beginner, that's totally fine. Every class can be enjoyed standalone. And Jeline keeps me company to break down the virtual triangle
Exactly.
of our internet mediation.
Yes.
If you're joining us from a country that is not the United States, please do let us know where you are joining us from. Or if you're joining us from a city that is not Spokane, Washington, please let us know in the comments. It always makes us very happy to know where you guys are joining us from.
Absolutely. We love that these classes are so international, and we just feel more connected knowing where you are.
That's true. So please do leave us a comment telling us where you're joining us from. We hope that you've had a lovely Christmas. Kuwait, that's amazing. Greece, that's wonderful. Please do keep them coming. It makes us very happy. New Delhi. For those of you who celebrate Christmas, we hope you've had a wonderful Christmas. We're going to be doing a Christmas special on our Discord discussion today. So if you'd like to join us for the bonus Christmas discussion, the philosophy of Christmas, as it were, join us on Discord after this session. Thank you for sharing where you're joining us from. Mexico, Dubai, Turkey, Moldova, Montreal. That's amazing.
Excellent.
That's that's very cool. That's a wonderful way to start this class.
Yes.
Okay, so all you need to know before we get started is that we have a couple of rules. One of the rules is that we don't use notes. So everything it's not improvised, but we don't use notes. We try to make it feel live. We try to make this feel like an event, something that has stakes. It's like you go to a concert, you don't want somebody reading out the lyrics to your favorite song. We don't have any notes, and our goal is to provide you with some of the basic ideas within Hegelian, Kantian, transcendental philosophy and speculative idealism, but to do it in a way that is hopefully entertaining and fun, and you don't need to have any background in philosophy for. So I think we should start.
Sounds good.
Do you want to do a synchronized coffee sip?
Yeah. It is very, very cold here, so we're going to try and stay warm with a low caffeine and launch right in. How is
This
it?
is very good. Before we start, we also want to say a big thank you to our patrons. The only way that we can keep these classes open access for you guys joining us around the world is because of the generous support of our lovely patrons. And our patrons also get access to all the classes as an audio download, as podcasts essentially, transcripts, bonus discussions, community features, and of course my ebook, The Hermeneutic Temptation. So before we begin, I just want to say on behalf of everybody watching these classes for free, and on behalf of myself who gets to teach these classes, thank you to our patrons who are providing the motor fuel for this engine to keep running, essentially.
I like that.
I don't know, that's a bad metaphor. We're in a car after all.
You know, it fits because we're in a car.
Exactly.
I feel like it's appropriate, yes. We are in our high-tech recording studio, which doubles as a mobile coffee retrieval.
That's right. For those of you wondering why we film in our car, it's because when we started these classes, we did not have a Wi-Fi plan, so we would steal Wi-Fi from cafes that we would go to. And because the car is like a recording studio, it is soundproofed and we can sit next to each other, and we like everything being very low tech. Everything we do is on an iPhone. There's literally nothing here except 2 iPhones. Everything we record is on an iPhone.
I feel like that's magical.
That's the world. Okay, let's begin. Let's begin. What are we going to do today? We're going to talk about a lot of different things. We're going to talk about happiness. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about the politics of happiness. We're going to talk about the Hegelian difference between abstract and concrete universality. We're going to talk about the Lacanian Bard subject. And if all of that sounds like new to you, we're going to string it together in a way that will hopefully make sense. Okay, so let's begin. I read an article, a highly dubious article, I should say, that suggested that happiness is not shared equally amongst society. Of course, this much is true. Not everybody is equally happy. And the article suggested that if you separated society into conservatives and liberals, that conservatives tend to be happier than liberals. Which I thought was kind of interesting, the idea that being a conservative makes you more happy than being a liberal. And so, of course, there could be a false correlation. maybe being happy has to do with other things than being a conservative. Or perhaps being happy has to do with the fact that most conservatives are white, relatively well-educated, older citizens who have security and comfort in their life. Many different things.
Yes. The premise, it seems like the sort of ideological premise of conservatism is to keep things the way they are. In other words, you are happy with how things are, thus you seek to preserve your idea of them.
That's what you would say, right? That's sort of like the
That's my
cliche
gut
about
reaction.
conservatism.
Yes.
So I realize that this is the perfect way to illustrate the difference between two versions of what are essentially false universals. In other words, the relationship of the universal to happiness. Because the universal within philosophy is one of the key concepts, whether we refer to it as essence or truth or, I don't know, the metaphysical substance that lies behind the barrier of reason. The universal is like the Holy Grail within traditional, transcendental, metaphysical philosophy. And so let's think for a moment about the difference between a conservative and a liberal apropos the universal and what it says about society. A conservative posits an a priori universal, which the conservative calls society. And that society has to be conserved, which usually means it has to be prevented from changing, change being represented by the youth, the people who will replace you someday, and the other, foreigners, migrants, imaginary or otherwise. And so part of the conservative worldview is that there is such a thing as a society, as such, a universal core of what makes a society, and this has to be protected. The liberal view, on the other hand, takes the idea of the universal and doesn't place it within the confines of society and the state, but within the confines of humanity as such. This is, of course, also the idea of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism being simply the idea that we can take this melting pot of cultures and ethnicities and religions, and that at a fundamental zero-sum level, we are all humans. Now, of course, there are problems with both of these positions. And the problems with the conservative universal and the liberal universal is what we will be talking about here.
That's a nice illustration.
Does that bring anything to mind?
Yeah. Well, it actually brings to mind sort of an interesting overlap between them, which was a show you started to watch about Pope Francis trying to, in a sense, bring to light the contributions of older generations. And this idea that particularly in American society, the elderly don't have anything to contribute. And trying to react against this by saying, here are a variety of people who are over 70 who continue to make valuable contributions to society. It's not like they turn 70 and their career's over and they don't add anything. So which has elements of both that conservative and liberal.
That's the important thing, right? So the documentary that is on Netflix about older people and respecting older people blends the conservative and liberal take on the universal, which is, on the one hand, the conservative take would be to say, listen to your elders, they have wisdom, the wisdom of time, and if we listen to our elders, we would be a more harmonious society. That's conservative idea. The liberal idea is the real excluded part, the real voice of the voiceless isn't to be found in the other, it's to be found within the older generation. And so but here's the thing that you have to understand about Catholicism as it is represented through its media organs. It always combines conservatism with liberalism.
Well, and I think it's really important to point out that this liberal conservative binary isn't strictly speaking two, Venn diagram circles that hit each other but never quite overlap. Part of the point is that they often do overlap, and it's sort of the challenge that philosophy helps us overcome is how do we untangle those strands.
True.
Yeah.
True. Okay, so first of all, why would the conservative be more happy positing an a priori universal substance of society? It's because that both of the positions require a disavowal, which leads you to a reactionary response. What I mean by that is, in order for the conservative to posit the idea of society as a harmonious whole, which can be protected, there has to be somebody from which it can be protected. In other words, for the conservative worldview to exist, there has to be an external threat. In other words, the external threat is what creates the idea of society. That's the reactionary core within the conservative mindset, which is that if society and harmony and civic participation and the nation and the fatherland can only be properly experienced at the exact point that an existential threat to it is posited, there is no a priori universal substance. There's simply the reactionary process of suggesting that there was something that has been lost. Of course, that is MAGA, Make America Great Again, in a nutshell. Make America Great Again is the radicalization of the conservative universal positing, which is there was a unified singular America that is now gone and that has to be restored. Of course, the part that isn't said out loud is the part about this was a white, homogenous, slave-owning America, etc., etc. That's obvious. I think we don't even need to spell that out. And so the universal within the conservative worldview has a reactionary undercore, which is that it has to posit an external...
Oh, sorry.
That was you, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. I shifted.
That's wonderful. There we go. I like that you like actually managed to move the car. As a universal, for those of you listening to the audio, Jennaline did a little shimmy and the car shimmied back. Okay, and anyway, you get my point. Mm-hmm. Now, there is also a reactionary core within the liberal mindset. And here's how that works. If, within multiculturalism, within the idea of a universal experience of humanity, all ethnic, religious, nationalist experience can be subsumed under this substance of being alive, being human. The opposite is also true, that the ultimate equalizer is death. This is something that people don't always understand about the horrors of the Holocaust and the, if you want, like the perverted humanism of the Nazis. There's a very fine line, and Primo Levi writes about this within the concentration camps. There's a very fine line between saying every life is sacred and saying every life can be disposed of. Once you reduce humanity to a zero-sum substance, the universal of the human condition, you can just as well say this is holy or this is profane. In other words, this is also the impossibility within death itself. Death presents itself to us as the most subjective experience. Only you can actually experience your death. Of course, your experience of death is a non-experience. And at the same time, your death is what connects you to everybody else. That is the one thing you have in common with everybody else, no matter how much you hate them. They too are going to die, and you too will die. Doesn't mean that you have to be in the same plot of Earth, but you are finite beings. And so the universal core within the idea of death, which is that death will consume us all, is in the same sense the universal core of life. To posit that life is universal, that the human experience shares a common core of being, is the same thing as positing that death is the universal of humanity. And so it can very easily subsume into its opposite. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, that's a bit extreme, but there's some more fun ways that we can think about it. You know, I've mentioned this before. You know, there's a show that I really like called Community. Mm-hmm. And you know where I'm going, right? Mm-mm. The Mascot. Oh, yes. Okay. So the comedy series Community is about a community college, and it's supposed to be a very multicultural, equal, accepting, humanist environment to learn in. Mm-hmm. And so they want to come up with a mascot. And of course, the problem in the United States historically has been that many of the mascots for sports franchises have racist overtones. And so the community college decides, let's have a mascot that represents the universal core of humanity. Now, you can go one or two ways. It's essentially the potato head problem. Is that what he's called? Mr. Potato Head problem. If you start with potato, and you start putting a nose on the potato, and you start putting eyebrows on the potato, this will make no sense to people joining not from the US, sorry. And you start putting various features, particular features, onto the universal substance of Mr. Potato Head, you will have, at a certain point, a specific particularized potato head, which is also why the company can sell you Mrs. Potato Head simply by taking away the mustache and putting eyelashes on the eyes. Same potato, no mustache. So the problem with the mascot is as soon as you start combining features, you end up with this like horrific thing. It becomes essentially like a sort of trans icon taken to the extreme, which is every ethnic feature on the mascot. And so faced with this problem, the problem of universalizing particular representation, the mascot in community college instead becomes the opposite, the zero-sum level of humanity, or Mr. Potato Head without anything.
Without any features.
Which they dub in community the human being. Like a weird take on Primo Levi, ecce homo, right? You know what I mean? Primo Levi in the concentration camp famously writes ecce homo, the complete desubjectivization of man within the Nazi concentration camps, is ironically exactly where community ends up with ecce homo, their mascot, the human being, who is this like horrific white onesie wearing. You have to Google it or put on Discord.
You don't have to,
Yeah.
but yes, it's...
And so this is ultimately the deadlock or the reactionary element within the liberal positing of an a priori universal, which is the idea that we can strip humanity of all its positive particular features of race, of gender, of ethnicity, of religion, and that we have like this amorphous blob that represents pure humanity as such, which of course is itself, again, an ideological fantasy, and a very dangerous one at that. Now, in a sense, what we have here is we have the positing of an essence that is either presented as an a priori or as a posteriori, but both of them are a priori. Here's how it works. The conservative says, to begin with, there was society, and it's only within a society that you have particular belongings. Religion, ethnicity, but also tribal belongings, familial belongings. And so the universal exists in the state. For the liberal, the universal doesn't exist within the state. The universal exists within the subject, within the human individual. In both cases, there is a fundamental paradox, which is that the state of the conservative a priori essence can only be posited through the positing of a reactionary threat, existential threat. Within the liberal worldview, it can only be posited by the idea of a fundamental antagonism or difference within the subject itself. Now, here we have, essentially, the difference between the anthropologist, structuralist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, and St. Paul, the Gospel of St. Paul. But I don't know, did you want to come in or was I going too fast there?
No, that works really well for me. And I think that also speaks to a really interesting point in the evolution of, let's say, conservative democracies and the preoccupation with property rights. Mm-hmm. That is very much the basis for how foundational texts in, both in countries like the UK, but also in the United States, have really shaped legal structures. Because the essence of property rights is to try and demarcate what others don't have access to. It's to prohibit infringement onto your perceived right of access. And so the idea is you're always trying to prevent outsiders, whether it's your neighbor, whether it's the foreigner, whether it's the person who was actually on the land before you arrived. It's to try and justify that occupation. And so it's not even about, as the basis for conservatism. I think that's really helpful.
It's also one of the reasons why Roman society is upheld as an icon within conservative thought, because the Roman idea of the domus, which is essentially a universal subset of the nation, in which the father, the patriarch, is the monarch of that society, that is, of course, a fantasy for people today. It's also why the Roman system was so property rights oriented. The rights that you were granted as a Roman citizen were specifically the rights to be the ruler of your own domain within the universal umbrella of the Roman Empire. Within the Greek system, within the oikos, we don't have the house, we have the household. And the difference between the house and the household is that for the Romans, the house is the domestic sphere that you guard against society. The oikos, the household, is the domestic sphere that is part of your public interaction with society. So we have a front-facing idea within the oikos and an inward-facing idea within the Roman Empire of the domus.
Yeah, that's really good.
I mean, we could do a whole class on why, like, the way in which we project Roman ideas into conservative ideology is messed up, but, or like, anyway. Roman numerals are often a sign. Okay, so what I wanted to posit here is a difference between Claude Lévi-Strauss and St. Paul. So Claude Lévi-Strauss, famous structuralist anthropologist. When David Graeber refers to himself as an anarchist anthropologist, it's a bit of a play on the idea of Lévi-Strauss, who was a structuralist anthropologist. Now, what does it mean to be a structuralist anthropologist? Strictly speaking, it means that you're interested in language. Not studying the language of the tribes, but you're interested in the formal structure of language. I'll explain that a little bit more as we go along. Lévi-Strauss originally wanted to be a philosopher. That is his inclination. He very strongly believed that there was nothing to be learned from society, from sociology, that could be applied to metaphysics. And so it's ironic, of course, that Lévi-Strauss becomes perhaps the social scientist par excellence who achieves a kind of return to metaphysics within the social sciences. Apropos of that, we have St. Paul. And St. Paul's writings, specifically on the law and on love, St. Paul's writings achieve something very similar, which is that it introduces a kind of metaphysical, sociological incision within the idea of the New Testament and the new faith. Now, St. Paul has this idea, which is essentially, when you first look at it, the classic liberal take on universalism. St. Paul says,